Welcome to Hard Stories, the 24th Annual DART Awards Roundtable. For anyone who's new in the room, I'm Bruce Shapiro, Executive Director of the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma, which, for those of you who don't know us, is a project of Columbia Journalism School devoted to effective and innovative reporting on violence, conflict, and tragedy, and their aftermath around the world. This is one of our flagship events of the year. When in the sort of carrot and stick approach that's necessary to making journalism better at its job, this is the carrot, in which we recognize innovative, effective, and ethical reporting on trauma with the DART Awards. Earlier this evening, you met this year's winning stories, so I don't need to run through all that again, but I want to reintroduce you to our panelists, each of whom will talk a little bit about their projects and how they came about. We'll have a conversation about it and at some point involve you in that as well. So on my far right, your left, is Neil Barsky, publisher of the Marshall Project. Next to him, Azmat Khan, freelance journalist, in this case writer for the Sunday New York Times Magazine, author of The Uncounted. Next to her, John Woodrow Cox from the Washington Post, and the winner of the DART Award for his remarkable series on the effect of gun violence on children. And to my immediate right, your left, Lizzie Presser, writer for California Sunday Magazine and recipient of support from the Investigative Fund for her remarkable project, Losing Gloria. I'm going to kick it off with a kind of general framing question, which you can either answer or ignore and speak however you want to speak. And I'll pitch a few more questions at you. We'll have a conversation, and then we'll take it to the room. Okay. Every year when we do the DART Awards, I'm always trying to kind of look and see if there are patterns, if there are things that bring them together, and kind of common themes that students in this room now or journalists who will review your work and lessons from it in years to come can learn from. And one of the things that struck me about all this year's winners is that each of you undertook projects that are challenging, not just because the subject matter itself is daunting and hard and complex and trauma-drenched, but also because in some sense each of you focused on a subject that people think they already know, or indeed may have grown weary and fatigued of. The criminal justice system, and prisons, and police violence, and the war in Iraq, gun violence and children, immigration policy and deportation. All of these are the things we hear about every night, and yet you decided to undertake them anyway. Tell us a little bit about how and why you embarked on these particular projects, and how and why you decided to get past the compassion fatigue that kind of inflects so much public discussion of these crucial things. Neil, do you want to start? Just because you're down there and I'm up here? And
Sure. Well, with the Marshall Project, so we don't have much choice. We have to do what we do. But there's definitely a risk of fatigue in what we do, and we always have to think of innovative ways to tell the story. So, the conceit behind Witness is very simple, which is that people are very accustomed to hearing from certain people. People are accustomed to hearing from wrongfully convicted men and women. They're used to hearing from prosecutors. But there's a lot of people we don't hear from. We don't hear from crime victims very often. We don't hear from guards, the gentleman in the video of how scary it is to walk the halls of Rikers. So what we wanted to show was as you were as earlier said, the ecosystem of criminal justice. And the idea was, by being very informative, what's it like to be a judge with 200 arraignments in a day, and what's it like that we could create a sense of outrage about the system. The byproduct of that, though, was, and the surprise of that, and largely because we've just found great, amazing storytellers, was, and this may be why we're sitting here now winning this award, was what we discovered, or what we were, what people brought to us, was the humanity, the courage, the compassion. There's a guy, Ed Gavigan, and Azmat Thomas, who are two people who were, both cases, stabbed within an inch of their lives, and to hear their stories and break your heart, and say, how do they have the strength to find compassion and forgiveness? Or parents of somebody who was murdered, et cetera. So, we're not, the Marshall Project doesn't typically do film, so it was not hard for us to not replicate what we were doing. But, then it only occurred to me later, I don't know how many people here ever read Working by Stud Sturkell, which was an oral history journalism that came out in the 70s, and it was interviewing regular people. And I remember reading it as a kid. I think it must have been a teenager. And what always struck me was, the profound wisdom of people who are not, famous, regular people. And also their humanity. And I think that the real value of witnesses, besides the educational value, which is considerable, is these people who will never, ever going to meet again, and we would never have met but for witnesses. And just to see how courageous they are in the face of all this adversity on every friggin' side of the criminal justice system.
So once you sort of decide, okay, we want to do this 360-degree view, okay, that sounds great, but talk a little bit methodologically, how you
Sure.
decide to approach it and why.
So I have one film under my belt. I directed a film called Koch. Jenny was the producer, and we basically got the team together, frankly. We hired Lindsay McGrew, who would become the producer, and she spent, along with Marley, who you mentioned, they spend the time really doing the due diligence, interviewing people, rejecting people, having a storyboard, yes, maybe, no, moving them around. We definitely need a judge. Very hard to get a judge, so we have found retired judges. We definitely need a cop. We definitely need this person. We had types we wanted, and we did that together. I contributed, Jenny contributed, and the researchers really did a lot of work. They went online, they interviewed people. They probably interviewed over 100 people. We ended up shooting about 28, and we ended up using about 19. So it was a collective effort. Then, of course, you get, and when I remember the first interview we did, it was kind of flat. It was a guard from somewhere. He didn't really come through. He kind of, I said, oh shit, this is going to be terrible. And then all of a sudden, to Rafe, the gentleman who was a Rikers guard, and I said, oh my God. And then for 4 days, we had intense shooting in a studio in Midtown, Chelsea. And we knew we had something incredible. And anyone who's working a film knows, or any raw reporting, that's just the beginning. You have to sculpt it and edit it. And then Jenny comes in and works on that. We had a great editor, Seth Bomsey, who constructs the art of it, right? So then how's the music intersect? I mean, then it's just film, and that's really hard. And that's a whole nother, we could have had great interviews, and it could have been kind of flat. So, it was very expensive. I'm not going to say how much it was. It was very expensive. We had, you can see all the friggin'
We'll settle
funders.
for very expensive.
Several $100,000 because we want it to be great, and because that's how much these things cost if you want to have a high production value. If we hadn't done it that way, it wouldn't be as good. So I'm very happy we did it. We had some very generous support from people you mentioned. We're a nonprofit, so we had to do it that way. So it was like doing a mini film, and then of course there's a distribution angle, which I won't complain about, but that's very challenging as well. So,
complain. It's all right. The complaint
well, it's not a
desk is
complaint.
open.
It's just how do you get 19 3 to 5 minute videos? How do you get people to watch them and share them? And we hooked up with the New Yorker and Condé Nast, which was a phenomenal partner to have. And we also then would go to other websites like Now This News, and then they would atomize it and do it in their style, and that would like explode. But of course, they'd be half the length and kind of jittery and not quite what we did. But they had so anyway. In the end, we're very happy with the result, and we also are showing the series now in schools, in prisons. We have a grant to distribute it. I would say, and this is probably true of every digital product, but particularly video, the making it is hard enough, but the distribution remains challenging. We've talked to a lot of partners. We're doing one now on immigration, becoming an American. We're in the midst of doing the research. It's very exciting, and we're thinking through I'm confident it's going to be great. But we need to solve for distribution because it's hard, and especially the Marshall Project is, relatively modest in scope. So we're talking to a lot of partners, and I'm sure we'll get a great one. But that's how we did it.
All right, thanks. Azmat, you talk about compassion fatigue and talk about even subject fatigue. News consumers, readers of the New York Times, and anyone who cares about politics has now been paying attention to Iraq through a generation of two American wars. What made you take on the story, and methodologically, how did you think about it?
Well, this was a story that really emerged out of what was clearly an incomplete portrait. And I can just take you through briefly some of the background that really brought this about. So ISIS, as we know, swept territory in Iraq and Syria beginning in 2014. And Mosul was a big part of that. That's when Americans started to pay attention. And by 2015, ISIS had taken over the areas you see in light red. Today, you're looking at those pockets of dark red that are left. So there's clearly been, a rise and fall of ISIS, and amidst that, a lot of coverage. Now, behind, sort of what's responsible for the fall of ISIS is, what has been called the precision strike. And this is just an example of one of the U.S.-led coalition bombs that have been dropped in Iraq and Syria. And you can see how precisely it hit exactly the targets that it was meant to hit. And these videos would get uploaded to YouTube. I would watch them and you would see a level of precision. And in this case, what was designated as an IED facility that was hit very accurately. And part of this campaign led by the United States, Operation Inherent Resolve, by today has conducted more than 14,000 airstrikes in Iraq, more than 15,000 in Syria, dropped more than 106,000 bombs, killed as many as 70,000 ISIS fighters, according to government officials. And also, according to government officials, only 883 civilians. That's an incident rate of 0.7%. These are impressive numbers. So I'm watching this war unfold, and I'm looking at these numbers, and I'm looking at these videos, and I see that all of this information is coming from the air. It's these aerial views, and I really just wanted to understand what it was like for civilians on the ground. ISIS had banned the use of cell phones, so civilians were not sharing their own stories. Most of the information we were getting was either from ISIS propaganda or from the U.S.-led coalition. And so I just want to step back and take you through sort of what it was like on the ground and sort of this ground view by introducing you to an Iraqi family. This is Basim Razo. He lived in Mosul with his family. He had, this just gives you a sense of how advanced Iraq had been in the 80s. The engineering schools were so good that if you were rejected from an engineering school, if you weren't good enough to get into Mosul University, you would wind up, and you had the money to, you would wind up coming to the United States and going to Western Michigan University. That would be your backup choice. And so Basim had lived in the United States, in Michigan, for a number of years and returned to Mosul in the late 80s and lived there with his wife, Mayada, his brother, Mohanad, his daughter, Tuka, and his nephew, Najib, who was a teenager. And they really struggled when ISIS took over. They were living in Mosul, and, it was my desire to understand, what it's like not just to live under the threat of ISIS rule, but also these airstrikes. And so they lived in side-by-side homes in Mosul. And it was difficult, but they coped by really spending time together as a family, eating meals. For Najib, the teenager, he was incredibly depressed. He was incredibly lonely. There weren't just rules. We often learn about the rules ISIS imposed. They weren't just on women, they were also on men. And so, one day he was caught by ISIS enforcers for wearing a Western-style T-shirt and given 10 lashes. He was severely depressed. And that happened in the summer of 2015. Now, that video I showed you earlier, this incredibly precise strike, what it didn't show you was that these were the Razo family's homes. And it didn't show you what their homes look like today when I went back to visit. This is from May of last year. It doesn't show you the destruction. It doesn't show you the people whose lives were taken. And so, I met Basim in May of 2016. And really, I had been interviewing other survivors and victims, and this is one case I was looking at that I just really wanted to know, how representative is this? How often does this happen, and why did it happen? So my reporting partner, Anand Gopal, and I essentially set out to do a systematic sample of 3 areas. I mean, I tried to sample even more areas than this, but this is what was possible. We visited the sites of more than 150 airstrikes, and the systematic sample was 103 airstrikes in 3 areas that represent a lot of the kinds of ISIS towns that had been taken over. So a densely populated urban area like the Aden district of Mosul, a medium-sized suburban municipality like Kayara, and Shora, a very small town that's typical of a lot of these more anonymous settlements ISIS took over. And these are just some of the pictures of the kinds of devastation that we found. Just for time purposes, I'm not going to take you through each of these examples, but I can tell you that this is a lone survivor of an airstrike. Her name is Rawa. I've been in touch with her family even since the investigation was published. This is a family who had lost a wife to ISIS. ISIS had assassinated her and killed her, and precisely a year later, 18 members of this family were killed in an airstrike. These are parents who stayed in Mosul, the El Leila family. On the right is a prominent gynecologist. On the left is a soil mechanics researcher who refused to leave Mosul because he didn't want ISIS to take over his library. He had a huge collection of books, and they wound up dying in an airstrike. These are children who are playing near the site of an airstrike that killed 6 members of one family. This is a man whose family wasn't killed or injured, but his home was destroyed because ISIS had moved into a house next door and started a weapons facility. And so these are some of the images that we found and scenes we witnessed, and also cases like this one in which no civilians were killed and an ISIS target was hit, and the goal was to figure out, well, how often does this happen? And what we found was that 1 in 5 of these airstrikes killed a civilian, a rate that was 31 times higher than what the government's own numbers were, our analysis of the government's numbers, and the areas we went to were likely conservative compared to the rest of Iraq. While we traditionally think of a lot of this as the result of, so-called collateral damage or just sheer proximity, in fact, we found that in half the cases, it was the result of poor or outdated intelligence, in which they had targeted something thinking they were combatants when in fact they were civilians. And we also found that the coalition failed to keep accurate logs, which meant that when people turned in allegations of civilian casualties, that people like Bassem Razo, or that dozens of other families that we were talking to who lost family members were unable, in many cases, to even get the coalition to admit they carried out the airstrike on them. And so what we found was a broken payment system, one in which people were unable not only just to get their losses recognized or officially acknowledged as being civilians, they were counted essentially as ISIS and faced threats, but also that they were not then getting any kind of condolence or compensation. The first payment offer made for a civilian death in this war was to Bassem Razo as a result of our questioning the government about it. Part of this investigation was also in getting documents to try to understand why people were targeted. But at the end of the day, I just want to go back to some of my earlier remarks. I think it's important to look at these images. These are families who asked us to show these images. So at the top, you'll see a family in Mosul. This woman, I met her 6 months after the airstrike on their home, and she still didn't have medical treatment. You can see, the skull on her head, which is just startling to me. And 2 days ago, I got data about this family that the government acknowledges and has known for more than a year that this was a civilian casualty incident. I turned over this information more than a year ago. And they've never been contacted by the coalition. So these are people and stories that, when you're interviewing, a lot of ethical issues come into play, and I'd be happy to
And
talk
we'll
more about that,
have a round about
that's-
ethics later.
Yeah, exactly. But that's sort of what we set out to do and why.
All right. And really applying a lot of social science method along with classic journalistic method to this important story. I mean, John, you've got this issue that if there's any issue that provokes kind of autonomic responses from most news consumers at this point, it's gun violence. It's just this magic issue that makes people's fingers immediately type out the same sentence, regardless of which side of the issue is on it. They know what they think. You decided to do something different. You decided to do it with kids. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think, first to the earlier question, I want to talk about that just very briefly. I think what makes all of this work successful is its intimacy. All these stories up here, I think about Basim, if I'm pronouncing that right. It was his story, right? So there were these hundreds of people, thousands of people who've been affected, but it was the closeness of his story, and him dreaming about feeling his wife's skin. I still remember that detail, and I think that for us was the guide. Was these stories are told over every day, hundreds of times. While we've been sitting here, a kid has been shot in this country, for sure. There's 24 kids every day get shot in this country. And those stories are never told, and from what we found, they're never told through the eyes of children. People go to the parents, and they go through the teachers and the therapists and the law enforcement. So the idea was to take something that is extremely familiar and tell it in a brand new way that we felt like nobody else had told it before. And not knowing really how that would go. But, I had found in the piece that Linda, my editor, mentioned that, kids, I think we underestimate them as journalists. One is they have no idea what they sound like. So when they're telling you something, it is just the way they feel in that moment. And they don't know that when I say this thing, when Tyshawn is getting ready for his father's funeral, and he says, he just looks up and he's trying to figure out how to put on a clip-on tie, and he says, whoever invented guns needs to stop. That's what he said. Now, he doesn't understand the political ramifications of what he's saying at all. If an adult said that to me, I wouldn't even write it down. That would never appear in my story. But when a second grader says that to me, it's something different. And I think it was for me, it's over and over, it's a lesson. The hardest character, subject in any of these stories was probably the 4-year-old, because he was 4 years old. And I came into his life 1 week after he'd been shot in the head. And doctors had done an incredible job saving his life. And if he had a hat on, you wouldn't know him. He was running around the room, and his mom was trying to convince him to not do flips and roll around on the floor. But, even Carter and his sister could talk vividly about that experience. A 4-year-old could talk vividly about that experience. And I had to confirm everything he was telling me with his sister and with his mom. But he remembered the sounds, and he remembered the way it felt. And I think, it's almost like this secret that I feel like, well, I don't want to share it, because, it is intimidating, right, to write about children. But I think we can apply this in so many different ways to the work that we do. Is we assume things, right? We assume things about communities. We assume that maybe the military is telling us the truth. We assume that maybe we can't get access to a judge, and sometimes we don't try. And the effort to just try. Ricky and I pursued a lot of stories that didn't happen. They never happened, and we chased them, and they didn't ever appear. But some of them did. And but I would go back to that original idea that I think that what makes any story successful, whether it's familiar or not, is, for me, is intimacy. Is I remember the individual, over and over. It's that person it's that old journalism term, go narrow, go deep. I think that I always try to apply that to anything I do.
And Lizzie, talk about narrow and deep. And you've got an individual, but also the interlocking individuals in a family. You've got this story that is there's a pebble thrown into the pond, and you're writing about the ripples of it. But again, it's an issue that everybody, that's at the heart of our current political debates, that everybody thinks they know. in a way, why bother? And then once you decide to bother, how do you do it? What made you go after Gloria and her family, and what was the method that you applied to make this issue so vital and vibrant?
I came to this story, actually, I was in England and I was writing for newspapers, and I was writing about, I did a few stories on unaccompanied asylum-seeking children who had come to Britain and had been absorbed into the British foster care system. And I spent a few days with a couple of kids, some from Syria, some from Eritrea, and those conversations really stuck with me. They haunted me in this way. Not only what was being said, but what wasn't being said, especially in a country that was becoming increasingly hostile to immigrants. And I knew I wanted to try to get my head around the complexity of being an unaccompanied asylum-seeking child in some way, but I didn't have the space to do that there. And when I came back to the States, I started to think about our own immigration system, and I started to think more about children who had been left behind by parents who had been deported, almost as another kind of unaccompanied minor. And I wanted to really understand what it felt like to lose a parent, a mother in particular, I think, and to be brought into the foster care system in this country, and to be caught at the nexus between those two systems. And in terms of like why I thought I could do it differently, well, I didn't know if I could, but I think that a lot of what was being written about was about the fact of deportation, or trying to prevent deportation from happening, or how families would feel if they were separated. And I wanted to know what it actually felt like to be separated and to lose your parent, and what it meant to carry that trauma and to watch it evolve over many years. So when I went out looking for a family to follow, it was actually very complicated because of confidentiality laws for kids who are in family court. But I interviewed 7 families before I settled on the Marins, and I was drawn to them at first because I thought, this is fascinating. These 3 kids lose their mother, and they're each brought into a different kind of part of the foster care system. One goes to a boot camp with 300 kids in the desert. One goes to a group home in the suburbs with teen moms. And one goes to a relative she did not like and did not want to be with, but who had a green card, so the system put her with her. And I thought that I would be interested in exploring those different circumstances of the system. I think what I actually found was far more compelling about the piece, and what ended up being the heart, was learning the different ways in which each of these children, I think your word is actually better than mine, metabolized the trauma of this moment in different ways. And that's really what drew me to this family. So the first time I spoke to Angel, I agree with John completely. It's about intimacy and creating the intimacy. Angel got on the phone with me, and one of the first things he said to me was, I don't think I know what love is anymore. And I was floored by that sentence. It's like one of these things that's like, it's like he's a 17-year-old, so you don't know where this is coming from exactly, but you feel it so powerfully. And he was kind of explaining to me that he had felt like so much love had been taken away from him that he didn't know how to give it to someone else. And he didn't start there. He started with pain and anger, and that had turned into violence and depression. And then he had come to this place of trying to figure out where to go from there. And then his sister, when I spoke to her, she had had this dramatically different experience. At first, it was panic. She didn't call it that. She explained that she would sweat and she would get really nervous in crowds, and that if she was at the front of a classroom, she would vomit. She couldn't do any public speaking. She felt like she was being followed. And the pain of losing her mother had become so acute for her that she felt like the only thing she could do was to recreate maternal love by having a child of her own at the age of 16. And these were things she was telling me. And so these dramatically different reactions to that trauma and the way in which it changed these children's behavior over time, that's what felt like the story that I wanted to tell, so that we can begin to really understand what does a separated family mean? What does that do to people?
Among other things, each of these stories has a profoundly ethically driven, and each of them involves people who are vulnerable in multiple ways and from multiple directions, ranging from physical safety to legal jeopardy to professional canons of ethics to just kids. Dave Merchant, who we heard from earlier today, was in my ethics class here, and she would testify that we spend a lot of time here at Columbia Journalism School with our students hashing out ethics case studies, particular choices that reporters and photographers and editors have to make, not in general, but in the kind of minute particulars of important stories. And trauma, no matter what, adds to the weight and the consequence of these ethical choices. Could each of you, I wonder, maybe pull out of what I'm sure was a complex network of ethical calls one particular choice, one particular dilemma in the course of these projects that you either argued with colleagues with, argued with yourself about, argued with sources about, but a time when you really had to weigh conflicting ethical claims, which is often at the heart of difficult trauma reporting, claims of victims, claims of the story, claims of the narrative, claims of the public to know stuff, you name it. Neil, what was a particularly rich?
I was hoping I could go last and have more time to think about it. We didn't deal with children, and we dealt with people who signed releases and reasonably mature, fully developed people. And
Yeah.
I don't think any of the people who shared their pain with us, unlike the reporters in this panel, shared it for the first time.
Right.
So I don't know that we had to confront those things. We had journalistic judgments and we had to make, but somebody who talks about being stabbed and the pain of his recovery and breaking down and all this, I mean, I felt that was fair game, and this is somebody who, so we're dealing with mature people, and I feel that we had to deal with people compassionately and honestly.
You're still making choices about how much of someone's pain
Sure.
or humiliation or anger
So we
to
interviewed
represent.
Erica Garner. Erica Garner was the daughter of Eric Garner, the man in Staten Island who was killed at the hands of police who had been selling loose cigarettes. And we had the video of that choking. And so this is more of a journalistic judgment. How much of that do you want to show? I can't breathe. It is so hard to watch. But we did something else that was even more journalistically challenging. So we had her recount this, and you're just so outraged and you're watching this, and it's kind of revolting. Then we had a cop, Steve Osborne, who was very defensive about police tactics, and he also talked about the Eric Garner case. And he defended the cops. He said they're going exactly according to protocol, and da-da-da-da. And we showed the video again. And this was, I think, one of the reasons the witnesses worked, because we were actually, you could watch his. Now, we got a lot of pushback on that, because why are you showing this cop defending the cops in the Eric Garner case? So you have to sort of trust the intelligence of people. That's sort of the bottom line of journalism, good journalism. So we felt that by showing both, people can make their own conclusions. And so, but the whole point of the witnesses is that actually we do how we view things does depend where we're sitting. So I'm not sure. Those are hard journalistic, and I'm really glad we did. I mean, I think it's a much better series because we have a cop defending cops. I mean, that's a real large part of society, so I don't know how we could have avoided that. But we didn't have any sort of feeling like, oh my God, this person revealed something. What is our obligation to protect that person from herself?
Yeah.
That didn't come up, did it, Jenny? I mean,
No, not in that way. I mean, it came up with the Jackson trial.
yeah. Oh, do we want to show their son? This is a couple that's weeping over the death of their son. We found the video from the grocery store that showed the murderer coming in. We didn't show the murder, but the outside. So do we do that?
Yeah. Well, and that raises a visual ethics dimension, and that may be something we discuss too in this. Azmat, you're dealing with highly vulnerable people in a multiply occupied territory, and what were one or two choices you faced on this?
So obviously this sounds incredibly scientific, but that would mask the sort of just tension and fear of re-traumatizing so many people, right? You're asking them about the worst night of their life, probably. And it was something that we only were able to do because of time. We had time. And an example I would cite is just Bassem Razo himself. You know, I know that to write this story, I needed to capture a lot of detail. And I really resisted for a while asking him about the night of, because I knew that, you know, I would watch his lower lip tremble when I asked him certain questions. And, you know, I just knew that, you know, okay, next time I see him, I'll ask him, or next time I'll see him, I'll ask him. And I remember, I think I was in my 3rd or 4th trip to Iraq, and I was supposed to get it from him on that trip, you know, talk to him about the night of. And, you know, I would have lunch, we'd talk about many different things, and Bassem would say, "Oh, Azmat, do we have to? I'm having such a good day today." And so I'd be like, "Of course we don't have to, it's no problem." And eventually, over time, was how we were able to, you know, he became more comfortable with it over time, and he found a way to talk about it over time. You know, I learned tactics that were appropriate ways of talking about this, just based on other interviews. You know, I would often, you know, start off not with anything about an airstrike, but ask about, you know, your upbringing in Mosul. Tell me about your earliest childhood memory. Tell me about your marriage. Walk them through the chronology of their lives in a way that felt more comfortable. And so it was really just, time was such a luxury. It's what made this possible. But I remember coming back from that trip, you know, after seeing Bassem and telling Anand, my reporting partner, like, I know I said I would get this, and I'm sorry I didn't, but, you know, I can't budge on this. I wasn't able to do it. He didn't feel comfortable with it. And that wasn't an argument between us so much as it was that we knew that this process would be long and slow. And that's really what it wound up being. And I know it's a luxury, but I think it's necessary.
So, John, some measurable percentage of the calls that we get at the Dart Center are from reporters wondering, can they interview children, or should they interview children, or having big arguments with their editors about interviewing children. What were some of, beyond the sort of the 1,000-foot view, the big choice, do we interview kids or not? But once you're going down that road and you're working with your colleagues on the ethics of this kind of very fraught terrain, what was one choice that you had to make, one or two choices that resonated?
You know, there's 1,000 answers to this question, certainly, and Lizzie understands how fraught this is, you know, dealing with kids, and that you don't want to compound their trauma. I think that's true for anybody we talk about, but especially kids. I think you take additional care. Oddly, I think for me, the story from Las Vegas, we went to Las Vegas 2 days after the shooting. The shooting was on Sunday. By Monday night, we had identified that there were these twin high school seniors who'd both been shot and had lived, and found their mother on Facebook and sent her some links to some of the previous reporting and just said, could I get on a plane and come out and spend some time with them? And they said yes. And I think because it was so close to the event, that was extremely challenging reporting, because they were still in the middle of the trauma. And they will be years later, but that was really close to the event. And, you know, there were two moments that stick out in that course of that week. And one of them was, it happened to be that the shooting was at the beginning of their homecoming week. So the shooting was on a Sunday, and their homecoming dance was on a Saturday. And that was the arc of the story, was following these 6 teenage girls who'd all been at the concert over the course of that week. And on the night, what ended up being the ending of the story at the dance, one of the girls who had really kind of been the rock all week, she'd gone to school just a few hours after she'd come home from the shooting. She still had bits of gravel in her legs when from diving and hiding, and we're at the dance, and I'm there off the dance floor, and you know, it's a classic high school dance, and I'm seeing her unraveling in real time, and she just slips away, and she goes over to the principal and whispers to him, and then runs basically out of the gym. And briefly paused to talk to the principal to find out what was happening and what she had said, and then went outside. And I get to they kind of had a courtyard, and she was across from where I was. She was sort of on the other side of this grassy area, and she's barefoot and on the phone. And there was a choice there about walking over there or not. And I just decided, no, like, I'm not going to do that. As incredible as whatever this dialogue was, I knew she was talking to either her parents or her sister. She'd given me so much that week. All these girls had given me so much and so much access, and had been so willing. And this was a moment that I knew I could reconstruct it. I could ask her later, but I wasn't going to inflict additional harm on her in a moment that should have been one of the great memories of her life, her homecoming dance. And I just was unwilling in that moment to add to the trauma. And there was another moment. A couple of days later, we had gone to the school. I had some extra interviewing to do, and the fire alarm went off by accident, of all times, right, for this to happen. And I'm in this classroom, and in the second that it happened, it didn't dawn on me. We hear fire alarms all the time. For somebody who's just lived through a mass shooting, that's unbelievably triggering. So they all file out, and a little bit later in the day, they all come back in, and a little bit later in the day, I was getting a tour, and I walk outside, and two of the girls are over by the lockers. They had outdoor lockers, and they're both just weeping. And it's related to this fire alarm that had been maybe an hour earlier. And there was another decision to sort of walk over there or not. I was with the principal at the time, and he walked over and just decided again, like, whatever's happening there, I'm missing something, I'm sure. But, you're constantly weighing that as a journalist as do I ask this question today and ruin his day or not? Yeah. Do I wait? And I think we need to be human first. That's always, I try to remind myself that, moments can be so compelling as a journalist, but remember that you're human, and we have to not add to people's pain.
We also have, and we're lucky enough to have Ricky here, there were big visual ethics choices for you. What was one that played out for you guys there on the visual representation side?
I think in every piece there was, the first piece that we did, I think in a lot of ways would have been more challenging for Ricky even than it was for me. We came into 8-year-old Tyshawn's life a week after his father had been shot to death outside of his school. He could see the police lights from the lobby of the school. And I sat next to him at the funeral, and was there at a vigil, and was there when the day he went back to school. And, Ricky, some of the most incredible images were from that funeral. And, it's easier, I think, for some of us who have just notepads that we can disappear. But, photographers can't. I mean, they have that device, and it makes noise, but they have to be there. And, Tyshawn, when he approached his dad's open casket, just lost it. He couldn't handle it at all. And in that moment, he went right back up the center aisle, and his mother had to basically drag him back to the casket. And those, for me, are those images that Ricky got, behind the bush. He was sitting on the floor. You almost didn't know he was there. And those images are just so raw and are so much more powerful than 1,000 statistics about, gun violence in this country and 38,000 people, getting killed. That image, a kid reacting to his father, who's just been shot to death for no good reason at all, it just was unbelievably compelling. And Ricky did that over and over on these stories, sometimes under really difficult, dealing with really deeply marginalized families. I don't envy the job that photographers have to do.
Yeah. Lizzie, I mean, you're focused on an individual family, and one of the things I've certainly seen over the years is that when it comes to a particular challenging event, whether it's a loss or a big disruptive event like the deportation of a parent, there are conflicting desires sometimes within a family about how much to cooperate with a reporter. There are difficult reporters' choices about how to be embedded versus be a little bit of a fly on the wall, what to put in and what not. What's one of the bigger ethical questions that you played with here?
I played with quite a few, I
I'm
think.
sure you did. Choose one.
So one of the questions I had to deal with was that these kids had let me know, they weren't actually, one was 17 and one was 21 and one was 14, but I focused more on the 17 and 21-year-olds. They weren't kids. But they had told me really early on that they had had suicidal thoughts at certain points in their lives. For Angel, that was more present for him. And so I knew coming into this that there was a risk of triggering them or re-traumatizing them and taking them to a place that I did not want to take them. And so I knew that I had an immense responsibility if I was going to be asking them to talk about this trauma with me and what it means to be in that place for them, to take great care of them while doing that. So one of the things I did was reach out to a trauma therapist and ask her for advice. Like, how do you talk to kids who have dealt with trauma? How do you talk to kids who are talking to you about suicidal thoughts? And what kind of responsibility do you have there? And how can I do this work appropriately, even though I'm not a therapist? She gave me a lot of excellent advice. One of the things that really actually has stuck with me and was really helpful in my reporting was she explained to me that if you are going to go to a really dark place with people, that it is best practice to bring them back. And she explained to me what that meant to her, which meant to, once you're leaving that place, to ask increasingly light questions so that you can come right back into the present room. So that by the end of that conversation, you can put your hand on Yessie's knee and say, I like your jeans. And so you're in that space with them. Or like, the curtains look nice in the wind, you know? So that you feel like you have come back to this moment together. And so that was something I had to learn to incorporate into my reporting in a way I hadn't known to do before.
That's really powerful and great advice. We have time for a few questions from the room here. I think my colleague Kelly has a mic, last I checked. Yes, Kelly? So come on up to the mic, whoever you are, or are you passing the mic around, or are we just going to do it standing mic? We'll do standing mic. Come up to the mic. This event is being videotaped. It will be put on the Dart Center website, so don't say anything that would embarrass your grandmother or your grandchildren, for that matter. And maybe identify yourself if you don't mind.
My name's Carol Bogert. I work with Neil. I just have a question for the other people, not Neil, which is about your own trauma and what it feels like to report those stories and your own self-care. And I don't mean to aggrandize our role when obviously the trauma of the people that you're covering is so much greater, but it's not nothing. Talk about how you do the work.
Self-care, how much did you think about it, and what did you do in the course of this work? Don't all jump up at once.
I think this is a really hard topic to talk about because I never really feel entitled to take on the pain of the people who I'm working with, but I do think that inevitably we all do to some degree, especially when you're writing really intimate stories. And I don't think I fully appreciated the ways that I was affected by this reporting, and I think I paid the price for that for many months. I highly recommend therapy. I'm really learning what that means to take care of yourself while you're doing this work. I haven't figured it out.
Yeah, I could echo that. I mean, I haven't figured it out. I had said those exact words to a colleague yesterday who was writing about, had written about a couple of mass shootings and was dealing with the trauma of it and not knowing what to do. And I my advice was the same. It's really important to talk about this and to get therapy if you feel like you need it. I mean, I find that when I'm in it, I don't feel it as much. And then moments when I'm away. You know, the moment that got me was well after this series was over. I'm still writing about children and gun violence now, but it was Parkland. It was, you know, I was following a school shooter who was having some having a legal hearing in South Carolina, and I'm following that on my computer, and I look up, and you know, kids are being wheeled out of this school in South Florida, and you know, that's when I think a lot of the reporting suddenly, a year of this, hit me, you know, physically, and you know, there is this guilt, right, that you feel like you aren't owed that, you don't deserve that, because the people you're writing about clearly have been through so much worse. You know, we get to come back to our lives of privilege, and they often don't, usually don't. But I think as journalists, you know, we can't do our jobs unless we also take care of ourselves. So it's a disservice. I should tell this to myself, I think, too, but it's a disservice to the profession and to your employer and to the people you are writing about. You know, if you're not in the right state of mind, you can't do this work. So, you know, you have to talk about it and be conscious of it. And if you're having problems, which I think inevitably, if we're human, we do, that we have to address them. So I don't know what the solution is exactly.
Azmat, how do you think about this?
I think it's entirely healthy to feel pain when you're reporting on people who have endured pain you can't even imagine. And I cried often. I still do. Like 2 days ago, there was, you know, some of this data, I'm going through it. It happens. And I find that repressing it is what can be hard. And sometimes you have to, right? Repressing you in front of, you know, while you're doing an interview, or, you know, I think that there are moments in which you really do need to keep yourself in check. It's not about you, obviously. And when you're with these sources, you have to, you know, there's a level of empathy, there's a level of emotion that you can display, and then sometimes, you know, you shouldn't, because it's distracting, or there are reasons why you shouldn't sometimes. But I also, you know, was dealing with families, right? Families who were coping, families who were trying to get by. And to be completely honest with you, even though my experiences can't at all measure up to what they've gone through, I was always taking notes just about resiliency in general, the ways in which people found inner strength, what they turned to. You know, there's a section of the story in which Bassem Razo talks about how he's turned to faith and family, and how much that means to him. And I know that personally I turn to my family often. I'm very close to my siblings. The poor things, I would tell them the most depressing things constantly, and they're still really angry at me about that. But we would then do things that are a little bit sillier too. So I'm very into just like funny, silly, stupid comedies. So I watched a lot of American Vandal, which I highly recommend. If you have yet to watch it, it's highly inappropriate, but just sometimes the kind of thing that can take your mind off of the worst. And so there were a lot of escapes. There was a lot of crying, and there was a lot of turning to the people I love the most. And these are things I saw a lot of the people I was talking to, when they had the luxury to be able to do them, things that they would do.
Yeah. Brief ad, there are a lot of resources on the Dart Center website about self-care, www.dartcenter.org. Neil, your colleague exempted you, but I'm going to throw the net over you and say, is there any thoughts on this?
Well, you know, frankly, I don't think our reporting compares really to the intimacy. I mean, like I said, we filmed in the studio over 4 days. It was very powerful, but I was actually very focused on getting the story.
Yeah.
As it happened, out of the 20, this is just bizarre, but out of the 29 people we interviewed, 4 of them have passed away. One was D.A. Thompson of Brooklyn, Khalif Browder's mother, Vanita Browder, Erica Garner herself, who I'd mentioned, and then really poignantly, a man who had, the guy he's in the video, he had spent 30 years in prison. He was kind of like a street guy, very sweet. He's the guy who said, you know, learning to love in prison was very hard, somebody you don't really know. And he was out after 30 years in prison, he was out for 6 months or a year, I guess. And he died of natural causes, but I'm sure he was sick. So that was weird and difficult, but I don't want to sort of lump my experience or our experience with these reporters who are really, I think, experienced something on a different dimension. We were in a very controlled environment. People came to us, you know, so I do have a heart. I do empathize with and I do support the idea that, like, we're human and we have to, you know, not lose ourselves in our reporting. But I really wouldn't compare the making of Witnesses and the trauma we may have experienced with anything close to what I'm hearing and what everyone else on the panel have gone through.
Okay. Yeah. And let's make questions kind of quick, because we're going to have to land the plane in a few minutes, so.
Thank you. Thank you all for your incredible work. I've done work within human trafficking. Not a human trafficker, but working with human trafficking. Super clear. It's similar in terms of the self-care. And when I left that arena, I said, I only want to do something not so hard. I want to do something soft and beautiful and amazing. And I've been lucky enough to do that, but I'm in a hard place right now. But I'm looking at the entire panel, listening to the stories that you've told, the awards that you've won, and the title of this evening, Hard Stories. So given all of that, if you could write a soft story, what would it be and why?
Good one. Anyone want to jump up first? Want to think about
A
it?
sob story?
Soft story.
I think we did. I mean, I don't want to sort of differentiate us, but I mean, what these three reporters endured and went through is much harsher. There are a lot of inspirational stories in the Witnesses, and you do watch some of them and you feel really uplifted, because, as I said, what I got out of, which was a complete, not the intention when we started it, was the humanity, the courage, and the compassion, and where do people find that when they go through things. So
Yeah, and
I think some of them are sob stories, although I hope not sentimental, but they're very human, and they will make you feel better for having watched them.
Yeah.
It's not just about the trials and tribulations of being in the system.
And I think, Azmat, you also referred to, you're looking for resilient stories within this dark space. And I think that's part of the answer. Let's do both of your questions, but ask them quickly, each of them together, and then we'll kind of have people answer them together.
Okay, I'll try to be quick, even though it's a question for all of you. I wanted to ask about the people you didn't interview. So when you pick a topic and you look for characters and people to tell their stories, and you approach to people and you ask them, will you agree to be an interviewee in my story? And they think about it and they process it and they decide yes, but then you find a better story, or someone else is, I don't know, your editor decides they don't want this story anyway, whatever. How do you tell them, sorry, you didn't pass my audition?
Okay, so good question. How do you deal with people who don't make the cut?
After you've interviewed these people and your story's out, and then the situation is still very grim, like there's in Chicago, you still have violence in Iraq, what do you tell the subjects? Are they under the impression that once the public is exposed to their hardship, that there's going to be change, and when they see that there isn't, what do you say?
Okay, and these two questions go together. This is great because they're both about your protagonist's expectations and hopes for the story and what sometimes get disappointed, right? Anyone want to take it?
I can do that one. So after the story came out, I actually heard from a number of the families, a few of them that called me really angry. We're like, I've been talking to you for nearly 2 years, and I'm a box. You know, there were these vignettes throughout the story. Like, I have been talking to you for so long, and there's one picture of my mom or dad. And, you know, there's so many of Basim. And there was a lot of anger, and there were relatives of Basim that were angry. There was, you know, I don't even want to, and rightfully so, right? You know, I asked them for intimate, incredible details over a long period of time, and they wanted more. They wanted it to be equal among those that were featured in it, and I found that really hard. And I sat there and I was like, can I blame my editor? Who can I say is responsible
Always.
for this? But, you know, I am working on a book about this, and I am, you know, taking every single verified story that I have and am following through with it with with the military to get these acknowledged, and I'll continue to report on them. And so, all I could tell them was, look, I'm going to do the best I can. But there were moments that really broke me when I would have to interview people who did not play a role in, the story I was working on. And I remember once I was trying to find somebody from Fallujah, and I was at this hospital, and I sat down to talk to this man, and I very quickly realized he was not from Fallujah. And, he was so, like, his eyes, he had died, and he had been injured in something that wasn't an airstrike. He had been injured in a bomb that had been planted by ISIS. And his eyes were just, like, he looked terrified. There was something about, and he really wanted to talk to me. And I sat there with him for the whole day because I couldn't get up and leave. He was just, and that day was gone, and it wasn't going to make a story of mine, but it made me, work extra hard that, in the parts of the story when ISIS did something to a family, when it persecuted them, when it was repressed, to make sure to fit that in whenever I could, to achieve that, even if that man's story was never going to be told in the reporting I was doing, that I would try to reflect it in some way if I could.
Anyone else thinking about kind of managing or encountering the conflicting expectations of your sources and protagonists?
I'd love to hear Lizzie talk about the 7 families that, I'm really curious, like how, when you pre-interview 7 families and choose one.
Yeah, I think I come into those interviews being as clear as I can, that I'm looking at this story and that it's really helpful for me to talk to them, and I'll end up focusing on one story, and I don't know which one it will be. I also think, on the one hand, it does a little bit feel like an audition, which is a very uncomfortable space to be in because people are giving you a lot of emotional content, and, sorry to use that word, but, and you need to then, end the conversation, and you don't know if you're going to go back to them. That's really hard for me. On the other hand, the moment when I ask a family for a ton of access also feels like a burden. Like, I get nervous. I'm saying, like, can I spend 3 weeks with you? So I don't necessarily feel like guilt usually for not including other people's stories. And I think often when you're doing long form journalism too, like Azmat was saying, you can spend a full day with a family, and that feels also like a pretty in-depth interview. I don't know that I want to ask.
So I'm going to ask one other question to all of you, and then we got to land the plane. But it struck me, thinking about all of your pieces, and especially thinking about the intentions that you brought to them, that all of these Art Award-winning stories are, in some sense, exercises in witnessing. They're exercises, in particular, in narrative justice, in taking the kinds of injuries and wounds for which there is not really any reasonable compensation. There may be some money, there may be some jail, but these are, unanswerable wounds, and at least ratifying them through the power of storytelling. But narrative justice, narrative storytelling, has that once upon a time component. You have to actually get people to want to be with you, to want to be with these difficult circumstances, to want to be with these difficult characters and their difficult experiences. What are a few of the choices that each of you made to make the story not only tolerable but enticing? How did you think about that part of it, that I hesitate to say seductive, but that at least that once upon a time storytelling component to make difficult stories an inviting and compelling place? Neil, how did you think about that?
Well, by affirmatively agreeing to what we're doing, they are declaring themselves desirous of telling their stories.
Right,
In our case,
I'm thinking about the listen to the audience. Right? How did you make it a desire? How did you make these witnesses' narratives enticing to viewers?
well, that was just our researchers finding amazing people. I mean, really, they are irresistible. I mean, I think of everything that we did, the editing, the directing, the shooting, I think that probably the greatest coup was finding incredible storytellers, not all of whom were practiced. Ayanna Thomas spent 2 years in prison away from her children for a financial crime her husband committed, which she was mindful of, which she had knowledge of, and she used the money. And she was in prison for 2 years, and she says, if I was Madoff's wife, I would have had my Connecticut home and everything. And there's a certain liberation, for these people who are not asked often to tell their stories. And all we wanted really were honest people who were articulate, frankly. And, I think it looks like, well, geez, they were great, but we did a lot of work and a lot of sifting. But I don't think that was a challenge. I think people in this case wanted to tell their stories, and it is uplifting and liberating, and these are not people who are often asked to tell their stories. Some of them were, DAs and things like that, but I don't think that was our real challenge. Our real challenge was presenting it in a compelling way, and video is very hard to do, and I think we did okay.
Yeah. Azmat, how did you think about that once upon a time thing?
I mean, I think that, and I'm uncomfortable talking about this, so I'll keep it very brief, but I know that a major reason why The Uncounted resonated with many Americans is that the main character lived in America at one point in time. He speaks fluent English. He has a family dynamic that many of us can relate to. There's so many families that I was talking to, and one of them, I remember, it was hard. I remember thinking, how do I explain this? That this one man, different family, had 3 wives, and that, he had gotten into a dispute with one of his wives and moved with the rest of them into this home, and that home got bombed, and they're civilian. How do I write this in a way that Americans would understand? Or how do I include this? Or is this necessary information? And the reality is heartbreaking that the story that's going to resonate most with Americans is the one to which they can relate the most.
But it's about finding someone who's a protagonist, who's a bridge in a way. I mean, it's not. You could look at it as a negative thing, but it's also the necessity in any dark and difficult story of finding someone who can be a bridge into difficult experience, right?
While also feeling that responsibility, right, to get across the reality of things as well. He was an anomaly in terms of his middle-class background, and having lived in America, none of the rest of these families spoke fluent English. And so it's something I still think about, and it's why, in the book, there are 3 families, and one of them is Bassem's family, one of them is another family that I showed there, and a third is that last family that is, poor. It was something that was, I vowed to make sure to include because I still feel that weight. It doesn't have to be so enticing. It doesn't necessarily, enticing shouldn't mask the reality of what you're seeing, the full portrait.
Yep. John?
Yeah, from 10,000 feet, I would say that, I always write toward endings. And, a lot of storytelling is making people wait. The inverted pyramid is just a terrible way to teach what we do outside of breaking news stories, not to undermine anybody's teaching. But, whether that's within a section or the whole story, is withholding and keeping people, especially in really difficult stories, is you want. That's any sort of great storytelling. TV does this better than anybody, is before they go to commercial, they tease you with something. So you sit through the commercial and then you watch. And so I try to think of, when I'm structuring stories in those ways, with these stories in particular, what gave them their power were the children. And my editor and I, Linda, talked about this a lot, about reminding people that they're children over and over. And in a way that was just detail, is that you would just thread in throughout the story little reminders where there was a stuffed animal or maybe a little piece of dialogue or something that they were interested in or a piece of candy or whatever it was that just brought it back again, that this child dealing with this very familiar thing, gun violence, is a child. And that's what gives those stories their power, certainly the point of view as well, but just the detail that you're threading. And the idea was everybody has a child. They can relate to that, or they have a nephew, or they've certainly been a child. All these stories were in some way relatable. That was the idea anyway.
Lizzie, how did you solve that craft, that fundamental craft question?
I think it's been described pretty well. I definitely think it comes in detail. And with both what John and Azmat are saying, for my case, was about making them kids, and also setting them in an American landscape in some ways. My editor was really pushing for that as well. I think I don't necessarily write towards endings. That's an interesting way of putting it, but I definitely think in terms of suspense. And every good story, whether it's soft or hard, often they're built on suspense. And so that's how I'm thinking about my stories frequently. So where are the turns? Where am I going to surprise you? Where am I going to drop a note that you know that I'm going to pick up a little bit later and you can't wait to get to it? So I think about it that way.
Okay. Well, thank you all for an incredibly rich and provocative discussion, which will be of use well beyond tonight. Let me also thank the Dart Center's staff, Kate and Kelly and Ariel, who are all here and made it possible behind the scenes. And again, a thank you to the Kenneth B. Dart Foundation and to Chris Duggan for supporting this work now for so many years and in years to come. Thank you all. Let's take a break. And we can continue the conversation informally for a few minutes.